The question is, why do we study religion naturalistically? I'm interested in people, humans. This drove me into the humanities. I started out interested in English literature, interested in politics, interested in economics. And at the end of my second year, when I had to decide what to do, I was interested in philosophy. But that took me into questions about religion, and by which I mean beliefs and practices respecting the supernatural, I guess I could say, and institutions that support those beliefs and practices. This seems to me a fundamental dimension of the human condition. It looks to be very old. It looks to be very widespread. Later I'll talk about how it appears and arises in secular societies, so-called secular societies. And yet little is understood about our beliefs and practices respecting the supernatural. And this led me to eventually to a PhD in religious studies, where I had to take in total 36 classes about religions and pass them before taking my general exams. And what I encountered was enormous diversity in those beliefs and practices. And so an additional feature that we need to explain is, why are these beliefs and practices diverse, and how specifically are they diverse? It seems to me that this fact about us is a fact about nature. People are a part of nature. We are a wonderfully interesting, complicated, and distinctive species, but we're part of nature. And when I looked to the sciences that studied nature, I saw through evolutionary biology a unifying principle that could organize the whole diversity of life, of which human religious diversity is one small segment, can organize that into a framework of inquiry that could benefit from very diverse types of researchers, from botanists who are describing with wonderful detail the rich intricacy of a local habitat, comparative biologists who are taking the work of these observers and trying to formulate and categorize the diversity into meaningful units that can help us to penetrate deeper into understanding that complexity. All the way out at the other end to the kind of neurosciences, which are studying the brain and its ability to track information and respond in adaptive ways to its surroundings. Very little of that work in the biological sciences, or if that organizing principle had been applied to people, to these dimensions of people, at least, that I was interested in. Sure, dentistry maybe, or gut bacteria, or medicine. Yeah, we had a lot of biology. But when it came to understanding the features that seemed to me most striking, most distinctive, most, at first blush, I suppose puzzling when we look at the rest of nature, and distinctive, our rituals and beliefs and cultures, we hadn't yet applied these principles, and this was in the 90s, and so I began I guess, I had the good fortune of having people who put up with me reading outside my discipline, and I read and took courses in graduate school on evolutionary biology. I had the benefit of studying with a philosopher who was doing cognitive science. And this led me through a series of steps to work on collaborative teams in addressing smaller aspects of the problem, of the question of beliefs and practices respecting the supernatural. In religious studies, there is such enormous talent, I think, in terms of just the raw intellectual power of people who are able to master lots of languages and have such a facility with historical texts, the ability to interact in cultural anthropology with people who are very different and win their trust. Those are very important skills. But if you're in a discipline where there is endless debate and there aren't clear methods for settling those debates, and there isn't an overarching theory in which to locate the information that we're collecting and try to make it accessible for others who might use it, then a lot of what we might do can get lost. A lot of that effort can get retained in some book perhaps somewhere, but become not useful to people. And the great challenge ahead of us is to take this extraordinary knowledge that has been accumulated by other people and is being accumulated by those who study the questions I'm interested in, those who study beliefs and practices respecting the supernatural, and attempting to discover institutions that support cumulative knowledge in these diverse areas of inquiry that occupy the discipline of religious studies. Now that's very important for the fundamental science as well, because a key challenge for the science, the evolutionary science of religion, is to begin to extend its focus to look at material that scholars of religion have addressed for many centuries in some cases, that we've not even begun to think about yet. The role of extended regimes of that involve discipline and coordinated adjustment of one's sensibilities, one's body postures, one's movements, to develop sensibilities that organize thought and behavior in ways we don't understand yet. To begin to look back to the ideas of some of the people I just mentioned, the Greeks, but lots of thinkers throughout the ages have attempted to focus on questions which haven't been addressed yet. Social inequality is one such question that was addressed in research. It's a central question of political theory. How are we going to organize ourselves? Why should we give power to someone over our freedoms? How are we going to be human? How are we not going to let the biggest people around just bully us? How are we going to create a society? And the mechanisms of authority and control, their evolution, the development of stratified societies which are supported by cultural norms, the role of religion in those, the inequalities that can emerge and then be perpetuated over time and lead and create perhaps some of the biggest challenges to the planet now when they become systematic and I guess supported through institutions that don't have human interests to heart. Understanding that remains on the horizon of inquiry. There's lots of stuff we don't understand. Music and its diversity and its role in ritual life hasn't been addressed systematically. So to get there is going to involve extending the scope of specialization from the biological sciences, where I've broadly biological sciences, where I've found a home, back to the humanities and getting those folk involved. And those institutional challenges are hardly trivial. And they're, I guess, they will be resolved, I believe, because young folk get interested in. But getting them resolved in our lifetime, my lifetime, is occupying some of my attention now. I do think, though, there is a lingering concern that people in the humanities have, which is, to me, a legitimate concern. And it's channeling that concern that I see personally as my institutional objective now, which is that, hey, I'm focusing on something like, I don't know, I'm focusing on, say, Buddhist meditative practices in some century. And nothing of what you said to me reflects anything I know about this era. You're talking about beliefs. You're talking like coming from maybe a Christocentric background where you're thinking it's just beliefs in supernatural beings and that it's, it's like rituals. That's really overly simplistic. And it doesn't, what I'm interested in are texts that describe skills and the kind of a pattern of of specific cultural diversity, which doesn't really match up with even what I said at the beginning, beliefs respecting the supernatural. What's supernatural and rituals? And they're actually right. So we use these very simplistic notions initially to get some kind of headway into understanding, which we know is going to perhaps leave those concepts behind and develop new concepts. And the kinds of issues that they're interested in haven't been addressed yet, right? And so when you see someone who, particularly people who who have an interest in religion, have a scientific background, but have no formal training in the humanities, haven't done any history, and you see them talking about memes replicating that, it becomes very difficult to take that material and relate it in any way to the source material that the expert's working on. And that expert's right. That expert is very right to challenge and question the adequacy of those concepts. For me, that provides an opportunity for improving understanding, and it also provides a role for that expert in the great adventures ahead, where we begin to integrate humanities and science work. It creates and it also creates a responsibility for that expert to, rather than sitting back and doing what they do, to get out there and to try to change the way the science is done. I've talked about religion and evolution, the deep human past, human history, and most of my work over the past 5 years have been occupied with the present and the future, recording information about people now, the same people, trying to follow them around over time, and to see how they're changing over time or remaining stable. That's what a longitudinal study does. You ask people questions, you ask them the same questions over time, and you try to piece out information about where they are, their social, natural ecology, and figure out how it is that having values helps us to respond to our environments, how environments affect those values and beliefs over time. So it's very much present focused. And I got into this because I was involved in, around 2010, I was involved in doing ritual research, scientific research, and investigating how rituals affect us. And I met a former graduate of my department at Victoria University in Wellington, a guy named Chris Sibley. Chris was a double major as an undergraduate in psychology and religious studies. In 2005, he got his PhD from Victoria University in psychology. And I heard a lot about Chris because he's incredibly skilled in methods. He's a very good statistician, and he is prolific. He writes lots of papers, and I'd heard words like he's a machine and that kind of thing associated with him. And then when I met Chris, he was a super down-to-earth, nice guy who told me that he got through religious studies with a B+, and in that it impressed me that he had a real core kind of commitment to understanding people as a vehicle to improving the world around him. And for him, it wasn't the whole world. He was responsible for New Zealand or parts of New Zealand. He grew up in an area that was deprived and had seen inequality, prejudice. His mother was very talented at science, but her career was crimped in various ways, although New Zealand's an egalitarian society and the first to give women the vote. Women don't get ahead in science as easily. And he observed that, very close to his mother, and was just a very sensitive kid. And he became interested in religion as an undergraduate because he could see that this was really important, basic to people, and then psychology because he wanted to understand people. And in 2009, he created the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study on a $15,000, which is like in Canadian $10,000 research budget. because he became dissatisfied with standard social psychology. We need rich social psychological questions about people, their attitudes, their beliefs, also personality, demographic information, age information, religion information, if we're going to understand the mechanisms of, at that point it was prejudice, and he was really interested in the kind of effects of prejudice on people over time, those who experience it and those who produce it, the economic effects and the health effects. And so to do that and to really get headway at those questions required a longitudinal study of people in a natural human social ecology, diverse population, lots of people because of that diversity, and tracking them over time. So he started by going to the New Zealand electoral roll, obtaining a randomized sample, sending out questionnaires, obtaining in the first sample about 6,500 questionnaires. He piloted the questions, cutting to the chase, but he obtained these 6,500 questionnaires, entered all of the data. That's about 6,000 hours worth of time. How much time do you have this week? Right? He did it on his own because he had no support, and then attempted to do it again the next year, and did. And had a few volunteers helping out, just people that happened to be around the lab and were nice and could see that Chris was working harder than any of them could ever work, and led by that kind of example. And it had absolutely just no real sense of personal gain in this, was just trying to understand these mechanisms. And so being around a person like that was immediately inspiring to me, because I don't like inequality either. It bugs me. And to see someone that good not caring about it and willing to work much harder than I ever could, seeing a real talent, inspired me. So I had a question about religion and its effects on people, and he came back with a study with all written up, the methods section, everything, with 2,000 people in it, showing that an effect that seemed very plausible to me, which is that people talk about the effect of religion on social belonging. And we couldn't find that effect in our large study. And that was surprising. We are not replicating it. Why? What's going on? It seemed like you would get social belonging. And then we realized that there's an important covariate, or he realized, I should say, that there's a covariate that's missing, which is is someone disposed to feeling uncomfortable about not belonging. So some people really feel quite okay, whether they're part of a group or not, and others feel social anxiety even when they're in a group. Do you like me? Do you not like me in that? And so people who differ along this dimension of personality might experience social belonging, might experience religious attendance differently. Those who are attending more would get more benefit from social belonging because they're there with people, and those who are really just okay, whether they're with the church or not, might not get much benefit. He wrote the model, and we had this predictive graph of taking a person who was one standard deviation, so pretty far out from the average level of acceptance. You could get them up to the average level of social belonging, social acceptance, with church attendance of about 17 times a month, which seems like a lot, but that seemed very plausible to me. These effects are interacting with lots of other effects. And if it was just like you go to church once a month or 4 times a month and you're just at social belonging that's average, that would have been very implausible. So it immediately passed my reality test, and I thought, I'm going to just work with this guy. I want to do more about this. Because also at that time I began feeling a real sense of, I guess, interest. I wouldn't say duty, that's the wrong feeling, but a sense of interest in applying the kind of research I was doing more directly to my community, which we don't do. We have this luxury as academics of pursuing these questions. I'm interested in evolution. How can I use that understanding to apply it to just my city even, my town, my university, my family? I don't know what the unit is. And the attitudes and value study is a vehicle for doing that, but it requires a huge amount of patience. You have to accumulate data over time on people. You have to retain them in the sample. We were fortunate to get some funding from the government and from an external agency to support a larger network of infrastructure so that we can do the mail-outs without having, Chris was relying on his own income. By the point I got to him, I was looking at the budgets and thinking, this is not sustainable. We have that support, and we try very hard to follow people around, and we're able to address questions like, how do natural disasters affect people's religious sensibilities? We had a paper on that because Chris had started the study just before a major earthquake. The follow-up studies have been looking at recovery in well-being in different areas depending on how severely they were harmed by the earthquake. We are looking at religious conversion over the lifespan. So we see that although the trend to deconversion in New Zealand, like most places, is steady and linear, people are becoming disaffiliated. Within a life, people tend to deconvert less over time, and they tend to convert more. The probability of converting, if you're not religiously affiliated, goes up over time. You become more likely, and the probability of deconverting is quite high if you're young. That gives the net effect. But over time, that probability is reducing, and then at about 66, you see them cross. So within individuals, we can see that the whole trend is to becoming more traditionally religiously affiliated, and it's that gap in young people that's driving the kind of erosion, steady erosion at the population level. That's been interesting to two groups. Of course, churches are interested in this. Why are we losing? Well, it's the young people, but the older people tend to be gaining, so they find that interesting. But also governments, agencies are interested because associated with religion in our own country, we're discovering large hidden economies of cooperative benefit. And so we see that the churches and people who go to kind of the most demanding churches tend to put lots of benefit into their community through schools, through drives for food and gifts, especially around holidays, through relief to refugees, through volunteering is a huge and hidden economy. So now a lot of that's going into the community, but it's still part of this broadly pro-social complex dynamic of helping people who are not in your immediate family. So we're doing that sort of work now. The idea, though, that the attitudes and values study is just about the future is misleading because we are recording history with very high resolution at the level of individuals. And that's what longitudinal studies do. There aren't a lot around, and there aren't many that have rich social psychological questions and religion measures. And we have them in the study, and we can go back and tell you what's been happening in the country since 2009. We know the data are good because we're able to use the data to predict elections. We can see that we're getting such a large response. We've measured 22,000 people, over 22,000 people. We have 15,000 in the sample now still. And when you're sampling at that level across a country that's 4.5 million people, you're getting a pretty good distribution. We look at the census statistics and see that we're undersampling in some areas. For example, with Asian immigrants, we have to do more work. But across the age span, across gender, across the Pacific populations that live in New Zealand, we're sampling pretty well, and we're getting good predictive capacity, which suggests to us that we are identifying traits about people that help us to understand what they're going to do. And we have lots of health data as well that, so we're going to get mortality, illness, and that relationship to values. So we're recording all of this with a huge amount of precision that is unavailable to historians. I'd love to know what New Zealand was like at that level of detail a century ago. So trying to keep that going then becomes a responsibility for us because we are recording history for other people who might be interested in our time. The last thing I'll say about that is, we are looking at features of our time that are important and have to do with religious cooperation and prejudice. Because part of being in a religious group might be being prejudiced against other religious groups. In certain contexts, we see historical violence that perpetuates and looks irresolvable because the values that are attached to those contexts are transcendent values. People don't care about their interests. They care about the idea. In regions such as New Zealand, we don't find that. We find that the history of peace ideas associated in combination with the religious pluralism has resulted in religious communities that are willing to kind of identify themselves as religious across denominational lines. And once you get those sorts of identifications forming, you can see very interesting and what might appear at first glance puzzling phenomena. Anti-Muslim prejudice is a big problem worldwide, and it is a growing problem. And it's a problem because highly religious Muslim folk are like highly religious folk anywhere. They're in minority settings. They are the targets of prejudice. And prejudice affects people's ability to gain employment. It affects their kids, how the kids are treated at school. It affects their basic well-being. To me, prejudice is a kind of injustice. And so what we find in New Zealand is very high levels overall of acceptance across minority groups. But when we look at prejudice, we see that there's a Muslim prejudice gap. Muslims are by a substantial amount, more likely to be targeted as prejudice. Anti-Muslim prejudice is more acceptable among the general population. So we want to look at what's driving that, and we also want to look at what might help to redress that. On a paper that's under review, and hopefully isn't still under review when this video comes out, looks at the role of the media in driving some of that prejudice for the first time, because we have these very large samples and we are obtaining information about attention to the media. We can figure out how it is that media attention might be affecting prejudice, but we can also look at the dimensions of religious commitment, and what we find are traditional, very highly identified religious people in New Zealand tend to be less prejudiced across the board. This isn't consistent. We see this in the report data, and it's consistent with lots of orthogonal work we're doing with at the institutional level. Yeah, there are these networks of people that come together and pray together. Churches tend to be more accepting of other churches. Because religious folk, or we think it's because religious folk see themselves as a minority in a world that's kind of more secular. And so people of the faith tend to be much less prejudiced, and that creates an opportunity for outreach to these communities, which, by the way, any community that becomes alienated and marginalized for long enough will produce people that feel alienated and marginalized, and they get angry. And so urgently we need to think about institutions that are accepting. Well, hey, yeah, I know what it's like to be religiously marginalized too. I'm a super identified, evangelical or something in a world where I really am a minority. I'm not perceiving myself. And hey, I know what it's like, because I know that you're religious like me. You're going to church, you're trying to raise your kids after your own fashion in the traditions that you believe in, you take to be right and take to transcend you. So do I. So we see a very clear signal of acceptance through religion. Now that's interesting, because there have been these ideas that religious conflict between Christians and Muslims are fated to lead to a kind of cultural war forever. We don't see this pattern in our country. And so an interest in evolution can help drive a kind of sensitivity to how strategic responses might differ depending on local social ecologies, how resources within traditions might be vehicles for motivating commitment to others across ethno-linguistic boundaries. That's probably what religion was doing all the time. ethno-linguistic boundaries, share a religion, we trade. You know, that facility or that potentiality within religion is something that we're looking into now. I guess that's where longitudinal studies are. Longitudinal studies are about the present. We plan always for next year, but we're recording history for the future.